Hi, I'm Jennifer Troyer, Dean of the Belk College of Business at UNC Charlotte. So I'm pleased to welcome you to the UNC Charlotte Economic Forecast. The forecast presentation today will be followed by an expanded question and answer session. So please submit your questions at any time using the chat function. Over the years, we have been thankful to our friends in the business community for providing the essential funding that we need to be able to do this work, to have this event and share this knowledge. So sponsors help keep this quarterly economic forecast event complimentary. And it's complimentary for students, alumni, and members of our business community. So for those of you on Twitter, you can join us in today's conversation by using hashtag #NCForecast. So we look forward to seeing your tweets. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and our speaker, Dr. John Conadan. So John is the professor of financial economics in the Belk College. John has served as the director of the economic forecast since 1981. Each quarter, he interprets the data and shares his thoughts on where the North Carolina economy is going and what it's been doing recently. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Conadan.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon to everyone. And so this is amazing. This has been a year since we did our last first quarter economic forecast. And as most of you know, an awful lot of things have changed. And I've got this picture to remind everybody what things were like 1 year ago on our March 11th, 2020 conference. And there I am answering questions of reporters who are not social distancing. And you can see in the background several people leaving the presentation who are not social distancing. And lo and behold, none of us are wearing our masks. So things have changed dramatically in that very, very short period of time. And now we are all Zoom experts as we move through our professional lives going forward. So I thought that would be something that would just remind us of where we were a year ago and fortunately where we seem to be heading very quickly right now. So the outline for today is we're going to talk a little bit about the coronavirus in North Carolina and how it's affecting the economy. And the reason for that is that the coronavirus has dominated the economic picture for the last year. There's no question about it. The coronavirus will dominate the economic picture in 2021 as well. How quickly we come out of this, how fast we don't wear our masks, how fast we'll get back to doing things person to person is really going to be dictated by the virus. Second thing we'll look at is a state-by-state COVID experience in 2020 and and a look regionally at some things that have been going on as well. We're going to look at the job losses by sector and job gains back by sector and how bad it was in 2020. Another look at what the recovery will look like and what the outlook for 2021 is. And the last one, get a little political here, but do we need another stimulus package going forward? So let's start with the coronavirus. This is the slide that I used on March 11th back in 2020, a year ago. And as you can see, by March 11th, we had 1,205 cases nationally in the US. That day, we had 278 new cases that day. As of March 11th, we only had 8 cases in North Carolina. It really hadn't gotten here yet. It was mostly Northeast and the far West where the bulk of these cases were a year ago today, or a year ago this week. Right now, as you can see, we have 28 million cases, just under 500 million deaths. Now, these are not the CDC numbers. These are the Johns Hopkins numbers. They're a little bit more reliable and a little bit better vetted, I think, than the CDC numbers. What's interesting is the death rate per case is now running about 1.76%. So that's a little bit less at this point in time than what we were expecting. That was around 2.5% to 3%. Early on, that's what we were thinking the death rate was going to be. So it's turned out not to be quite as deadly as we thought. In North Carolina, we have just under 850,000 cases. We've got almost 11,000 deaths. And as you can see, our death rate per case is only 1.3%, roughly double what the flu is in terms of the death rate per case in this state during the past year. On a case by case or state by state basis, This is ranked by the number of cases. As I say, 28 million in the US. California leads by far. Okay, they're a big state, but they have an infection rate of 8.7%, just a little bit above the US. Texas, North Carolina comes in ninth in terms of cases, simply because we're the 10th populous state in the nation. And as a result of that, we're going to have a lot of cases. Our infection rate is a little less than the US rate, and certainly less than a lot of states that are around us in terms of number of cases. The infection rate by state, when you rank the infection rate by state in the worst states, as you can see, some states are almost double the US. North and South Dakota have very high infection rates, the percentage of the population that have been infected. And as you can see, North Carolina is really sort of down the bottom. We're 35th in terms of a state infection rate as a percentage of our population. So the virus has not been as bad here as it has been nationally, and certainly as bad as it has been in our most closest neighbor, South Carolina, which has an infection rate that's about 1.8% higher, percentage points higher than ours. When we look at deaths by state, this is a case where we're looking at essentially the number of deaths. California leads the deaths per state, and North Carolina, we turn out to be 15th. So we're in the top 15, or we're ninth in terms of number of cases, but we're 15th in terms of number of deaths, and that's owing to the fact that we have a very low death rate and a low death rate per case. So we've done a better job of treating those who get it in this state than is typical of states in the nation. In terms of the death rate by state, as you can see, some states have incredibly high death rates. In North Carolina, as I said, it's 39th in terms of the death rate per case. And then vaccination rates. This is something that's real interesting. Again, these are all as of the beginning of this week, March 1st. We've given out 50 million vaccines so far. That number is ramping up rapidly, well over 1 million a day, almost 2 million a day right now. North Carolina is in the middle of the pack, both in terms of the rate and in terms of the number in terms of the rate and also in terms of the second shot number. But once you get that first shot, and at this point in time, all we're looking at is the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which require the 2 shots, because the Johnson & Johnson has just been approved, and it's really not in wide distribution yet. You want to see that change dramatically. And so even after the first shot, a couple of weeks after, you've got a certain degree of immunity, not full immunity yet, but certainly a certain degree of immunity. So the faster we can give these out, the better off it's going to be. All right, so here's a really exciting figure in my case, from my perspective. So this is we have been using a 7-day moving average on cases because the reporting is so lumpy that it looks just like a jagged line when you do it on a daily basis. So we smooth it out with a 7-day moving average. And as of the beginning of this week, we can see that new cases in North Carolina are down 71% from the peak on January 12th. That was the holiday peak where people basically were fed up. They went home on Thanksgiving and also at Christmas and New Year's parties. So we had a peak on January 12th, and that daily new cases are down by 71% in the state as of Monday. On new deaths, again, a 7-day moving average there. They trail by about 15 days cases. So you see peaks in deaths about 15 days after you see peaks in cases. They're down 55%. But again, to correlate that to the cases, we got to wait another 15 days, and I suspect deaths will be down by 70% from their peak, which occurred January 27th. These are cases by county. Obviously, Mecklenburg and Wake, largest population counties, they've got the most cases. And just basically, this would pretty much without exception is county size in terms of the number of cases here. But when you look at infections on an infection rate, as it turns out, some of the bigger counties are not some of the worst counties. We've got a number of counties that have double the national rate of infections. This has a lot to do with smaller counties that had really bad experiences with nursing homes early on in event. And so that's what's really driving this quite a bit. And then last thing on this is looking at the death rates per case to see how that is. And as we can see here, and this one I've done a little differently. I've done it in terms of ranking the lowest. And you can see that some counties, these death rates are per case are incredibly low. And so the death rates range from 0.43% per case to 3.07% per case. All right. And so a number of counties, particularly in the eastern part of the state, have very, 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 very low death rates per case. And they're doing a very good job of treating people once they are in fact infected. So let's take a look at the state by state COVID experience. Here is the second, and just to kind of remind everybody, this whole thing started in March. April was the bad quarter. This is when we had the mandatory shutdowns. April, we started opening up again in mid-March. And so the second quarter, April, May, June, was the quarter that really got hammered. And what we saw was a number of states have some incredibly big declines. Remember, the US declined by 31.4%, but in the United States on GDP, we use an annualized rate. So the national economy only declined by 9% in the second quarter compared to the first quarter. You can see Hawaii had the big one, Nevada. The consistency here in Tennessee, the three. The consistency here is those are big tourist destination states, without question. Las Vegas here and Nashville here, and of course, Hawaii is Hawaii. So they had the big declines, but you had a number of other states that had some significant declines as well that are not necessarily tourist destinations. Vermont, Michigan, New Hampshire, New York, and New Jersey, Kentucky, etc. Had some big declines as well. We turned out to be 31st worst decline at 8.7% on a quarterly basis, below the national average. In terms of, excuse me, we had the big decline in the second quarter. What happened in the third quarter in terms of that big deep V recovery? As you can see here, the US got back to 96.6% of where we were in the first quarter. We've had several states that are almost at 100%. Utah is 100%. So they had one quarter down a lot and then back up to where they were a quarter later. Washington State, 99.8%, Iowa, 99, and so on. North Carolina turned out to be the 12th best in terms of return. US is at 96.7. We're at almost 98 at the end of the third quarter. We were almost 98% back, okay, to where we were before this all started in terms of GDP. Now, the other thing to look at, of course, is the unemployment rate. This column here is the February unemployment rate. These are the states with the worst increases in unemployment rate. US went to 14.8% peak. Nevada went to 30.1%, Michigan, Hawaii, same people the same states that had the big declines in output in the second quarter also had big peak unemployment rates during the second quarter. Again, North Carolina turned out to be well below the national average. We peaked at 13.5%. That's a new number. Before, up until 2 days ago, we were talking about 12.9%, but what has changed is that the state numbers have been re-benchmarked this week. And so our peak turned out to be 13.5, which is still only 30th worst. All right, now how have we recovered? So this is the February 20 unemployment rate over here. These are the states that now have the lowest unemployment rates in the country. You can see that a number of states as of December have below 4% rates of unemployment rate. 8 of them are at 4% or below. These all states had incredibly low unemployment rates going into this recession. So they're not back to where they were, but there's been a tremendous recovery. North Carolina, we're probably in the middle of the pack in terms of the employment recovery. We've done real well in terms of output, not so well in terms of employment. Okay, so we're less than the national average in terms of employment recovery of the states. All right, let's take a look at some job losses by sector. Some of this is a rehash, some of it's some new material. This is the chart that shows you the percentage job losses by industrial sector. The blue is the US, the green is North Carolina. As you can see here, without exception, the two sectors that had the worst job declines from February to April because of the shutdown were leisure and hospitality services, which have about a 50% decline in employment, both in the US and in North Carolina, and other services, which had about a 25% decline, to a little over 20% in North Carolina decline in jobs between February and April. Now, US lost 22 million jobs. We lost about 615,000 jobs total. This again shows you that the hospitality and leisure section and other services together accounted for almost 50% of the job loss, almost 49% precisely of the job loss were in these two sectors in North Carolina. All right, how are we doing coming back through December of 2020? All right, you can see here that many sectors are back to 95 or better percent of their job returns. And so what we're seeing here is just a few sectors, again, hospitality, leisure and hospitality, which we've gotten back to within 25% or so of where we were in February of 2020. Nationally, it hasn't gotten back as much because these are the industries that are affected by state shutdown rules. And what we're seeing here is, unfortunately, a lot of states that are influencing what's going on nationally in the hospitality and leisure industry. We'll have more to talk about that sector a little later. And then the other one that was hard hit was other services. And we're back pretty well here, but nationally, again, it's pretty low in terms of the recovery, again, because some states are still engaged in some significant lockdowns. All right, so this is kind of the unemployment rate during the first essentially 10, 12 months of the recession, comparing what happened in this recession, the COVID recession, versus the Great Recession back in 2008 and 9. And you can see that what's happened here is we have peaked terrible unemployment rate for a couple of months, but it's been coming steadily down. The rate for February was released this morning at 8:30, and the US rate is now at 6.2% in February. And as you can see, back in November, essentially, kind of an old Ghostbusters theme here, the streams crossed. So while that many months in, the 2008-9 recession was still, the rate was increasing. Here we are now below, and we are declining and continuing to decline. So these are very, very different recessions. And at this point in the 2008-9 recession, we were at 7.3 and still rising, and we were going up to 10%. We're at 6.2 nationally. We're going down, and everybody knows that this is going to continue to decline during the rest of this year. All right, so let's take a look at what happened in North Carolina in 2020, as bad as it was. Okay, this is the quarterly GDP numbers. Overall, we were only down by 2.6% for the year. Started off slow at 3% decline in the first quarter. That March, the impact we had on in March as a result of the big, the cases cropping up and people starting to behave differently. That March quarter really did. That March month really did affect the quarter and cause an overall decline of 3%. The big decline, of course, in North Carolina came in the first quarter, 31%. Then we had 36.8% growth in the third quarter. Now you would think that gets us back, but because we're, we started a high and we got a 31% decline. Now we go down here, we get a 36% increase from this level here, but it doesn't get all the way back to where we were, even though it's a bigger increase than the decline was. The base is lower than the second quarter decline. So we're seeing that, and in the fourth quarter we expect about a 3.94% growth, despite the fact that we had a resurgence of COVID in the fourth quarter. We still expect it to be a positive quarter, and therefore overall mitigate the decline for 2020 to about a 2.6% decline. All right, this is a sector by sector look. For those that are new and have not looked at or seen this graph before, this graph is taking a look at two things at the same time. One, on what you would call the horizontal axis going this way, is the percentage change in that industry's GDP during the year. And on the vertical axis going this way, this is essentially the percent that each sector makes up of total GSP or GDP, state GDP. And so this is essentially a pie chart in this regard. This equals 100%. if you look at the resulting rectangles, you get a sense as to how much impact each sector's, in this case, for the most part, decline had on the overall decline of the state's economy. Again, you can see here that the big sector was hospitality and leisure services with a 27.6% decline in GDP. The other one that was pretty big in terms of had a pretty significant decline and constitutes a good portion of the economy. So they've got a very, very big box here in terms of its impact, and that was durable goods. All right. So I also want you to look at hospitality and leisure services, a big decline here, but it only makes up 2.4% of GDP. This will come back. We'll talk about this in a later slide in terms of what's going on and what the recovery is going to look like. Okay. So as you can see, all but two sectors experienced declines during the year. Finance, insurance, and real estate actually grew in the year, and non-durable goods production, a lot of PPE, et cetera, that was being generated also grew during 2020. On the jobs, we lost 190,700 jobs. Now, the peak, of course, we lost 600,000 in, between February and April. But for the year, December, only 190, because we got an awful lot of those jobs back. Only one sector, transportation, warehousing, and utilities, surprise, 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 which is basically supporting the online purchasing that has been going on during this year. It grew during the year in terms of jobs. These are all the Prime, Amazon Prime workers and the other workers that are delivering products to people's homes these days. Anyway, the big loss again was hospitality and leisure services, 20.8% job loss from December of 2019 to December of 2020. So losses were a lot bigger than that in terms of jobs, but a lot of them came back. Notice here that it makes up 9.5% of the North Carolina economy. Very interesting. 2.4% of output, 9.5% of jobs. File that away. Finally, employment growth dropped by 4.2% during the year. Okay, so what's the recovery going to look like? We've shown you this slide before. We got the deep V, but we also have the dreaded K, which is lots of the economy follows the deep V recovery, but some parts are still struggling. Okay, the ultimate is that consumer confidence is going to decide in terms of how this recovery is going to go, how comfortable people are as the infection rates and death rates go down, and they are doing that. People get vaccinated and we start to approach herd immunity. How are consumers going to respond? How are they going to feel about going back to crowded places with people they don't know? And that's going to be a very interesting trend to follow going forward. All right, as far as consumer confidence is concerned, it took a hit during the virus, as you can see, starting in March of 20 and coming down. February, before the big event, consumer confidence was very, very high. But during the event, it only dropped down to, in the 80s, which is not real bad, considering that during the height of the 2008-9 recession in March 2009, when we were really in trouble, and probably 5 or 6 months after we started to see some bank failures, it was at 25. Okay. Now we're at 93.1 and we're fairly stable, and we expect this to probably go up, but it remains to be seen, and it will depend incredibly, it will depend on how consumers feel about going back out in April, May, etc. All right, so herd immunity. Okay, this is kind of an interesting thing that we're talking about here. So we got 328 million people in the US. We have 255 million that are eligible to get the vaccine. And I say that because anybody 16 years or under is not eligible to take the vaccine. So in order to reach herd immunity, the number that's out there a lot is 70%. I've seen low as 60, as high as 80. I took the midpoint, 70%. That's 178 million people that need to either get vaccinated or need to have had the virus in the past. It is estimated that we will, in fact, dose by the end of March 130 million people. That's a combination of the 2-dose Pfizer and Moderna and the 1-dose Johnson & Johnson. This is the estimate by the government, by the CDC, by Johns Hopkins, And the trend in terms of the difference between the end of February dosage and March doses, if that trend continues, we will reach 200 million people vaccinated and having had the disease by the end of April. You do the math, and it's out there. And so what I am suspecting is, without mutations and we continue to be able to get people vaccinated, and we increase the rate at which we're vaccinating people, which we have been doing consistently since we started vaccinating the public in January. We should be close to herd immunity by the end of April, if not there. And certainly by early to mid-May, we should have achieved a 70% immunity rate amongst the population if everybody goes out and gets their shots. And this is my one public service announcement that I usually try to avoid. I've had my shots and I had no difficulty with them whatsoever. And hats off to the people who administered them to me. They did a wonderful job, and they were working incredibly hard under very, very difficult circumstances to vaccinate people. So just go out and get your vaccine. And end of my moral lecture. All right, so here's a kind of unemployment pattern that has taken place, and the blue line's the US, down 6.2%. Latest numbers we have right now for states is December, and North Carolina was down to 6.1%. I expect us, when the January and February numbers come out, the January numbers will be out later today, actually. When they come out, that we will be down pretty close to 6%. And maybe even below 6% when the February number comes out. All right, in recent recessions, again, this goes back to a slide I showed you earlier, and that is that the months to peak in terms of the unemployment rate were very quick in this recession. In the last 3 recessions, they've been almost 2 years since the recession began till the unemployment rate peaks and starts coming down again. We're already way, way down, and the national rate is 6.2% in February, and our rate is 6.1% in December, and we're below the national rate. I'm pretty sure of that in January and February. So let's take a look at what's going to happen here in 2021 as this recovery begins. All right, we expect the economy to grow about 5% this year. It's going to start off rather strong in the first quarter and then kind of taper off a little bit as the quarters go on. But even though none of these are 5%, it's sort of a yearly average. And of course, that big drop in the second quarter back in 2020 basically lowers that base. And so overall, with this 4.5% average growth here per quarter, it's going to give you a mid-year to mid-year growth rate in GDP about 5.1%, which is pretty hefty. On a sector by sector basis, what we're looking at here is that the only sector that will show a decline next year or this year is mining. But all the other sectors are expected to have significant growth, including hospitality and leisure, which will be up 15%. However, employment is a different picture. But the sectors, again, these big box, the bigger the box, the bigger the impact. Durable goods is going to have an important effect on the GDP for 2021, as is finance, insurance, and real estate, and business professional services, and educational and health services. These are all the ones that are really going to generate a good deal of growth in the economy going forward. Net jobs, 199,000 net jobs. Now, if you do the math from the last slide where I showed you we lost 190,000 last year and we gained 199,000, you'll understand we're getting all our jobs back pretty much, or pretty darn close to it. Okay. We think employment will grow by 4.5%. 1.5% employment growth in a year is great. This is phenomenal. Okay. And the sectors that are going to grow the most are going to be leisure and hospitality. Information is going to grow tremendously. Again, this is all generated by the virtual economy. And we're going to see durables and non-durable manufacturing increase jobs considerably during the year. As a result of that, what we're going to see is the unemployment rate trending down, and will be right at about 5% by the end of 2020. Now, that's not back to where we were when we got going, which was just below 4%. But on a historical basis, 5% is amongst the lowest unemployment rate that we typically get. It's rare for us to get much below 5%. And so getting back to 5%, when it's essentially 10 months from now, is a pretty darn quick recovery. Remember, we are 12 months into this. Most recessions don't peak for 2 years. When we get to the 2-year point, we're going to be below 5% rate of unemployment. So just keep that in perspective in terms of how well this recovery is likely to go. All right, I have some more to say about that in just a second. All right. So by the end of December, we will have, and this is, we expect to get 99.8% of our jobs or level of jobs when this haul began from February, not from December of 2020, but from February. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 sectors that will have more jobs at the end of December of 2021 than they had in February of 2020. And so, this is there are a few sectors that are struggling, obviously, 90% in hospitality and leisure, okay? And durable goods, even though it's doing much better, still in terms of the other sectors is probably the weak link in that. So essentially, by the end of this year, we will have regained virtually almost all the jobs we've lost during this. What can we expect? Okay, all right. I've talked about consumer confidence earlier, and we talk about the impact that it's going to have on how robust this economy is going to go. One thing I've got to mention is that in our 2021 forecast, we are assuming that we are going to reach herd immunity in the second quarter of this year. The problem we've got, obviously, is mutations, and another COVID spike that took place like it did in November and December and January of 2021, and also vaccines and the rate at which people are taking the vaccines. We've seen demand outstrip supply in vaccines because all of those who are amenable to getting vaccines were getting in line. What we don't have very good data on is how many people are simply not willing to get in line, and that is problematic. One of the things that concerns me is how quickly, when we opened up the next tranche in North Carolina earlier this week for educators, how quickly they've been able to get in line to get shots. Now, part of that is an increase in the vaccine availability. Part of that is an increase in our stations giving vaccines out, but also part of that is the fact that some of the folks in the previous priority groups chose not to get their vaccines, and we don't know what that number is, and that's the one wild card that's out there that could affect. We may have plenty enough vaccine and ability to distribute it in March and April to reach herd immunity, but that doesn't mean that we are going to be able to reach that simply because we may have a percentage of the population unwilling to get their shots. That's the wild card that's out there, and we do not, the forecast that we've done does not take that potential problem into account. All right, industries at risk in the long term, we've talked about this before. One of the reasons this isn't happening is because probably 30% of the hospitality and leisure industry firms simply aren't reopening even when the government bans come off of them. They simply can't. They're gone out of business and they have no capacity. And rekindling those businesses and recreating those jobs that were lost in those particular industries is going to be a problem. We're already starting to see supply chain shortages, mainly in electronic chips. We've seen car factories in this country and worldwide shut down for weeks at a time in the first quarter of this year because of shortages of chips. And we are now also seeing it in the electronics industry with some of the gaming platforms shutting down as well, unable to produce the product because of critical shortage in some areas. We also have accelerating the consumer trends and how that's going to affect the recovery going forward, online versus brick and mortar retail. We've lost a number of brick and mortar stores. A number of brick and mortar companies are closing stores. Saw one yesterday with Disney announcing further cutbacks of their brick and mortar businesses in malls. And we've seen mall occupancy decline considerably during this pandemic. People have been going to the mall, but when they start to go, they're going to notice a lot of the smaller stores are closed permanently. All right, industries at long-term risk. These are industries we've documented before: cruise ships, airlines, and intra-city transportation. These are going to be the hardest for people to make decisions to get back on. I'm going to get on an airline to fly to the West Coast, even though there are no cases out on the West Coast anymore, or the cases are really low. Do I want to sit on a closed airplane in what is essentially a sardine can with 140 other people who I don't know? And that's really the problem. The same thing with intra-city transportation, subways and buses, etc. We know the hospitality industry has been adversely affected. This is really the industries that are likely to be very, very slow in coming back, particularly conference hotels and resort destinations. All right, so this is kind of a comparison. I said at the end of the year, we're going to have 8,600 more jobs in North Carolina than we had at the end of 2019. Okay, so the previous slide, we said we got 99.8% back. That's from the February high number. But on a year-to-year basis, 8,600. GDP, 2.9% higher in the fourth quarter of 2021 than in the fourth quarter of 2019. In fact, we'll get back past 2019 fourth quarter in the second quarter. From a GDP standpoint, it's over and done with. The gap is gone. Okay. The only difference, of course, is the unemployment rate. We're going to be more than 1.5 percentage points higher in December than we were in December of 2019. But that gap will close during 2022 as we start to be able to open up some of those hospitality and leisure businesses that have gone out of business. All right. And this is that hospitality. Nationally, they account for 3.8% of GDP, 10% of employment. You can see why GDP recovers rapidly because it only takes 1% or 2% increase in other sectors to offset the decline in hospitality and leisure. But from an employment standpoint, that's the industry that's holding us back and holding back the unemployment rate from rapidly recovering. All right. So now we get to the really hot topic as Congress debates another stimulus package. We don't know where that is and how quickly that's going to unveil itself to us. But the question is, should Congress do another stimulus package? All right, so far we've had 7 bills, and this is a list of them. The big ones were the CARES Act, Corona Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act of $2.2 trillion, and the almost $1 trillion Response and Relief Act that was passed in December of 2020. All told, a little over almost 4.2, a little over $4.1 trillion in economic stimulus has been passed in 2020. In addition to that, there has been $700 billion in quantitative easing passed in the first half of this year, not passed, but authorized by the Federal Reserve. That's in addition. That's lending facilities and credit facilities and liquidity facilities that the Fed has to back up businesses that are having difficulty getting credit and liquidity. Okay, so that's 4.1 trillion in fiscal stimulus spending and 700 billion in liquidity. All right, of that, there's still 1.1 trillion that hasn't been spent. A lot of it at the Fed level, but even over $500 billion of CARES Act money hasn't been spent yet, and not all of the money that came in the last bill, this Response and Relief Act, a lot of that hasn't been spent yet. But that accounting isn't really available at this point in time. So this number is probably 1.5 trillion of the 4.8 trillion in authorizations that hasn't been spent yet. All right, so let's take a look at the $1.9 trillion in what we're the big items, of course, is direct payments to households, the new $1,400 checks that they're talking about. The next big item is aid to state, local, and tribal governments. and then pandemic relief unemployment benefits. I'll have a little bit to say about that. Aid to reopen schools and child tax care credit, which we're not exactly sure, that in the multi-employer pension aid, we're not exactly sure how they relate to the COVID case, but that's another issue altogether. Most of the rest of these are small amounts of money. Foreign aid, agriculture, veterans affairs, again, not clear exactly how most of these relate to the COVID case. We find out that 70% of Americans are in fact in favor of this Relief Act, and that's because 90% of them are in line to get a check, whether they need it or not. So the question is, do we really need this? All right, so let's take a look at this. Complicated, a lot of numbers, the bold ones, what you need to pay attention to. All right, this is something called an Oken gap, after an economist named Oken, obviously. And what it is measuring the difference between what potential GDP is, what we could do if we were fully employed and used all of our capital equipment at fully employed capital and fully employed labor. And then the difference between that and the actual GDP. So what we see here, and this is all done not on annualized numbers. The numbers wouldn't be different. The end result wouldn't be different, but it's just easier to see how much we lost in terms of when we do it on a quarterly basis. So in the first quarter, GDP was down $49 billion from potential GDP, the actual. Second quarter, big drop this time, was down $610 billion, lower than what it should have been, potential GDP. And then 255 billion, even though GDP went up considerably from the second and third quarter, it's still 255 billion below the potential for that quarter, and 232 below for the fourth quarter. Those are the four quarters we have numbers on. We've grown the economy in both of these quarters, third and fourth, over the big decline here. But the gap, the Oken gap, cumulative for the four quarters is $1.1 trillion. Okay. All right. Now, over the longer course of the 2008-2009, we got just under $1 trillion in Oken gap. Now, just to be clear, the potential GDP numbers, and again, we're looking at nominal numbers, not real numbers. The potential nominal GDP numbers in both instances are based on estimates made by the Congressional Budget Office, and they're sort of the official keeper of potential GDP. As you can see, these numbers are not that much different. This recession generated an $787 billion stimulus package to deal with a $921 billion Oken gap. Okay, so far we spent 4.1 trillion for a 1.1 trillion gap, and we're getting ready to spend another $2 trillion for a $1.1 trillion gap. This gap is not all that big, $200 billion. It's not a big gap. Probably would be wiped out within a year if we do nothing. All right. Again, you've seen this chart before. This is just that unemployment rate to kind of reinforce that again. All right. This is monthly job growth after the April debacle. And you can see how quickly we've added jobs back. We haven't got them all back. We had the bad December because of the reinstitutional lockdowns. But this morning, we just announced that February number up 379,000 jobs. So in January and February, we've had job growth. We've added 500,000 jobs back to the economy. 500,000 jobs back to the economy in 2 months. This is not trending in the wrong direction. This is trending in the right direction. Okay, so the question is, what is the rationale with the job numbers? And that's the most important one in terms of stimulus. What is trending here that's telling us we need another $2 trillion in spending in order to make us whole again quickly? But the biggest question, I think, is ultimately, how do we pay for it? All right, I got to go through this real quickly. What we're looking at here is a budget deficit this year that'll be in excess of roughly $3.5 trillion in 2020, and we will our budget deficit will be 14.9% of GDP. Okay, normally it's 3.5% of GDP. We're going to 14.9% of GDP, And as a result of this and continued budget deficits going forward through 2031, we're looking at some considerable numbers here that from a fiscal accounting standpoint, that are a little bit scary. Okay, we've added $4.2 trillion of debt in 2020. That has caused our debt to GDP ratio, that's the cumulative total of debt, to increase from 105% of GDP to 125% of GDP. That is incredible, okay? And this is $30 trillion here. We're at almost $29 trillion as we speak today. Do not go to www.debtclock.org. It'll scare you to death, all right? All right, interesting thing occurred. On March 15th, the Board of Governors reduced the reserve requirement ratios. That's the required amount of cash on hand that banks need to have to cover their deposit liabilities to 0%. All right, and they did this primarily to basically allow banks to be as liquid as possible and to loan money out as easy as possible. You've seen this before in past quarterly briefings, talking about excess reserves. They discontinued the excess reserves in September of 2019, of 2020, August of 2020, I'm sorry, and just went with total reserves because there are no longer, when the reserve requirement is zero, there is no longer a distinction between total reserves and excess reserves. And you can see that the two of them follow pretty much together. And you can see how since the end of 2019, when we've whittled down the excess reserves to 1.3 trillion, we've now added virtually $2 trillion in excess reserves, pumping money into the banking system. Okay, that is potentially inflationary long term. And here's the Federal Reserve balance sheet. We got that down to $3.7 trillion in August of 2019, and now it's shot up again to almost 7.6 trillion in February of this year. That's virtually double what it was less than a year ago. A year ago, and it is essentially the Fed not directly monetizing the debt, but indirectly monetizing the debt. It's a complicated process by which they go through the banks, but they've provided liquidity to banks in order for banks to buy the securities directly, the debt securities directly from the Treasury, and then the Fed buys them in an accounting maneuver and causes their balance sheet to go up from those banks. All right, so here's kind of a history of stimulus checks. The last thing we're going to talk about here. May 1975, Jerry Ford sent out $200 stimulus checks to try to get the economy back moving in the 74, 75. It's really the first stimulus check mail back that we had. And then we've seen the rest of these checks go. I put in this 2012. I wanted to make sure that everybody understood there's a tax law change that caused something to occur in the next slide. And then we had the April checks, and then we had the January checks. All right, so this is the personal savings rate. And if you follow this along, every so often, there's a spike, a spike, a spike, a spike, a big spike, another spike. If you correlate these are the months in which stimulus checks are mailed out. So I'm not exactly sure how much stimulus those checks are generating versus how much they're causing an increase in personal savings. Not that that's a bad thing, but you gotta start to question how effective stimulus checks are when every time you see a stimulus check, with this one exception, this was the tax law change that caused a lot of folks to take capital gains in December of 2012 because the capital gains rate was going to change in January of 2013. So factor this one out as a massive tax law change that affect capital gains. Excuse me. The rest of these spikes are associated with perfect correlation to monthly, to the month in which the stimulus checks were mailed out. All right, the last one I want to talk about, this real quick, is we've also seen a good deal of unemployment benefit fraud. The Inspector General for the Department of Labor estimates it at 36 billion. Excuse me, I'm sorry, 36 billion. Some private think tanks have estimated as high as $80 billion. 36 billion is 10% of the CARES Act supplement. 80 billion roughly is twice that, 20%. Big fraud in terms of these checks. Big fraud in the PPP plan. We just don't have the numbers yet. So a lot of this money winds up going not to the people who need it, but to people who may not need it, and foreign nationals who've been able to figure out how to con the system, because almost all of this is now done online. All right, so keys to watch going forward. As I said before, the virus will determine how this plays out. We've taken I think the moderate path in terms of what we think is going to happen, and therefore our forecast. But it is absent, our forecast is absent of mutations and future lockdowns. The other thing that's really important is watching this vaccine dissemination, because that's the road to immunity, herd immunity. And that is basically going to be driven by people willing to get that vaccine, much more so than it's going to be driven by either manufacturing capability or shot dissemination capability. The other thing is we got to kind of keep our eye on the third round of fiscal stimulus. The only thing I'll say about that is we're not sure when it's coming out, when those checks are coming, but I need to caution everyone that the January increase in the CPI, well, looks pretty small. When you annualize it for a full 12 months, turns out to be a 5% rate of inflation. So this is something that's starting to become a serious concern with us going forward, particularly if we have a third round of stimulus. The Consumer Confidence Index, that's going to help us understand how people are going to respond to the reduction in lockdowns and starting the economy back again. The U.S. monthly job growth, I just told you, we had 339,000 jobs in February, new jobs, and the unemployment rate dropped. That always comes out the first Friday at 8:30 in the morning. The Federal Open Market Committee, which determines interest rates, which of course is zero now and zero reserve requirements, they meet again on March 16th and 17th. I don't expect them to say anything important at that meeting. The big thing I think we need to look at is first quarter GDP, which will come out at April 29th of 2021. If we start to see a 5 or 6% growth in this first quarter, and it's being held down, remember, because January was not the best month with lockdowns. But looking at that, we'll get a really good key between that and this right here, vaccine dissemination, what the rest of the year will look like. So I want to thank you all for attending. I think that been more optimistic today than I have been for the first couple of the last three of these quarterly briefings. And I will sign off now and let Jennifer take over, and she will start asking some questions.
Great, thank you, John.
Thank you.
We're now moving over to the question and answer portion. So we have several questions that we've received so far. You can still submit your questions through the chat function at this point. Okay, so the first question comes from Katie with Axios Charlotte. So she asks, in the Charlotte area, the health of the hospitality industry, especially in Uptown, depends on business travel. So what do you anticipate business travel will look like in the near term? And if it doesn't bounce back to the pre-pandemic levels, could Charlotte's hospitality industry be permanently harmed?
The answer to that question is I have no earthly idea, particularly the last part of it. But definitely that's right, that the Charlotte hospitality industry, particularly the Uptown, the Charlotte, and it'd be Mecklenburg County, relies heavily on business travel. And to the extent that that really generates most of what's going on uptown, it provides the critical mass that keeps that going. And that has been empty this year. I mean, it's clearly been empty. I will simply tell you that there are starting to be industry groups that are starting to talk about having in-person conferences. Jennifer, this will maybe help some folks understand this. I do a lot of speaking for these groups over the year. Obviously, my last speech last year was in February. Starting in March, there was nothing going on. I am starting to get feelers for, I have one already in April. But I'm starting to get feelers for industry groups that are starting to do destination travel. My guess is this will be an iffy year, 2021 in this. But I fully expect that industry to come back pretty quickly in 2022 if we get the herd immunity. I think that group is much more likely to be the group that will get fully vaccinated, et cetera, and that people will not be hesitant to gather together with people who they basically know. from a professional standpoint. So I think that that part will come back. What I'm most concerned about is the impact that this 2020 has had on driving businesses out of business, particularly restaurants. We've heard, not in Charlotte, but we've heard nationally in some areas as high as 30-35% of restaurants have closed permanently. We don't know how true that is. That data on establishments is 9 months in arrears. So we're just starting to get some data on that. We won't know until late this year how many establishments in that industry have closed permanently. But that's where the problem is. So what you'll see probably is an incredible excess demand for starting in the second quarter of 2021 for the restaurants that are still in business. But you won't see jobs rise because we're probably going to see a quarter or a third of the restaurants not there anymore.
So, question about consumer confidence. So so you talked quite a bit about the stimulus package, the potential stimulus package at the end. What link is there between, direct checks to 90% of the population and, consumer confidence?
Well, it'll be interesting to see. And it's a good question, because what we've seen in the first two checks that people got this past year, they saved it. And they saved it because they know it's raining out. They're not fools. And people pretty much do the right thing. They act in their own best interest. It'll be interesting to see what happens with this check. And that's because if this passes, it's likely to pass. And I have to tell you that I pretty much think it's a bad idea. From an economic standpoint, I don't think it's necessary. But it'll be really interesting to watch when the checks come out in probably April, what happens with that savings rate. And that savings rate is, right, you get it right at the time. If the savings rate doesn't spike, that's going to tell us a lot about consumer confidence, because it'll tell us that folks that don't think it's raining anymore. That's a pretty heavy price to pay in terms of the $400 billion to find out whether consumers are regaining their confidence. But nevertheless, it will tell us whether or not consumers are now willing to go out and spend that money because they don't think it's raining anymore. And that's a really important piece of information.
Okay. So a question about the U.S. debt. So the questioner asked, says, I read in this morning's Wall Street Journal that the CBO projects national debt to reach greater than 20% of GDP in the next few decades. So does that concern you, or is that forecast too sensitive to future unknown variables? And then the second part of the question is, how do you think our country can feasibly keep the debt to GDP ratio under control?
Okay, we're already at 125% debt to GDP ratio. Again, we got to keep these things separate: deficit versus debt.
Right.
Deficit's what's going on annually, and we're now at about 15% deficit this year as a percent of GDP. That's this year. Okay. Going forward, I don't see that. I mean, I see 4 to 5% deficit to GDP ratio. That's what the CBO numbers are telling us. The debt to GDP ratio is a whole nother ballgame. All right. And to kind of throw everything in perspective, back before the 2007, 8, 9 recession, the US debt to GDP ratio was in the 65% range. So that was the cumulative deficits over the years as a percent of our current GDP. So in other words, if we work for 2/3 of the year for free, we could pay back our debt. We are now sitting at 125% of GDP, the debt to GDP ratio. We basically doubled it in 15 years. Okay, we can't continue to do that. And as an accounting measure, for those that want to keep score, anytime the deficit to GDP ratio is above real GDP, nominal GDP growth, okay, then the debt to GDP ratio grows. All right, and so if we're forecasting out 4 and 5% deficit to GDP ratios, we're going to be growing from this 125% debt to GDP ratio. Now, I know that's a lot of debt deficit, but my point is that, it looks as if this 125% debt to GDP ratio is going to rise over the next decade. Not significantly, 1.75% a year, but it is going to rise over the next decade.
Okay. So that question for you. So the question is, of the 500,000 deaths that we've had from COVID in the United States, many of them have been among older individuals. So does this cause any material change in Social Security or Medicare spending?
It's a good question. And I actually, about 3 weeks ago, I did the calculations, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but 80% of the deaths are 65 years of age or older. So the 500,000, 400,000 were seniors. That's a small percentage of the total seniors, okay, that are all collecting Social Security and are all on Medicare now, okay? I forget, but 2%, maybe something along those lines. I forget the numbers precisely, but it's a small number of people that have been prematurely pushed out of collecting Social Security and Medicare benefits. So in terms of the trouble that Social Security is really not in trouble. That's an easy fix. A few economists and a couple of accountants could sit down and fix Social Security in a very painless way in about an hour and a half. Medicare is a whole different ballgame, as you know, having been a health economist in your past life. That's a whole different game. And so, this has minimal effect on both of those programs. And with Medicare being the big budget eater, you're not going to notice a change. It's rounding error on Medicare.
So we've seen people shopping more online. We've seen some businesses move to just being online. What are you sort of projecting in terms of whether that's a permanent change or a temporary change, and what sorts of implications does that have on the commercial real estate market?
Well, as this is very interesting. As I mentioned in the presentation, when you start going back to your mall, you're going to see that a number of stores aren't there anymore that were there a year ago, the last time you were at your mall. The big chains are downsizing. So the mall anchors are downsizing. We've seen recently a North Carolina icon go through a bankruptcy, reorganization bankruptcy. We've seen Macy's over the past year announced several times closing of bad performing stores. And so, and this is a combination of the pandemic, but the truth of the matter is the pandemic has simply accelerated a trend that had been going on for a good deal of time. And when you think about it, you've had this switch from retail to online banking going like this, okay? And all of a sudden you got a jump in it. Well, now that we're starting to gain herd immunity and folks are starting to go back to the malls and the shopping centers, you're going to expect it to come down. The question is, you've had this trend to online, it's going to come back down, but it's not coming back down to that trend line. It's coming down a part of the way. The trend line is going to continue, but it's going to be considerably above where it was when this all began, or it's considerably above where it would have been had this not happened at all. And so, we're seeing this. Too many goods, Jennifer, are basically commodities, and it's just a lot simpler to do online. And people got pushed to do this, and they're going to continue. What I'm interested in finding out, and more so than the effect on retail brick and simple retail brick and mortar, what I'm really interested to find out is the pullback as it relates to food shopping, online food shopping, versus choice versus time savings, and also the impact on takeout restaurant consumption. Those are two things that spiked dramatically during this period of time. They're going to cut back, but the question is, how much are they going to cut back? Are people going to say this was okay? Okay. So, yeah.
I mean, I think, similar question for working remotely. I think that's a big question mark.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so some questions about the durable goods market and supply chains. So two linked questions here. So, is the decline in durable goods due to a lack of inventory? And then we've got a question here about the cycling industry in particular, and whether you have any information on that industry.
Don't have any information on the cycling industry, but in terms of the supply chain, the linkage is breaking down. What we had seen prior to this pandemic was a global supply chain. We'd all heard about it. And, in the automobile industry, a product would get, would maybe get put in the United States. It would wind up in Canada to do something, wind up in Mexico to do something, back in the United States to do something. It was just the cheapest way to do it. And borders and distance was not a factor, and individual country problems were not an issue. And the logistics of this is primarily because transportation has become so inexpensive. But now we're starting to look at a whole range of problems associated with these incredibly extended, cheap, but extended supply lines. And so how much going forward will businesses say, how do we prepare or protect ourselves against this in the future? Because we don't know when the next pandemic is going to be. My dumb guess is probably another 100 years. But what do I know, right? So it'll be interesting to see how they respond to that. My guess is a few will. There may be some government push on critical products, particularly PPE and drugs and some other things that they may force to be produced more in this country. But I think in terms of cars, I think your chips are probably still going to come from real low cost producers elsewhere.
Yeah, interesting. So this has been great. So I've got one more question for you, John.
All right, one more question.
Close this out. Would you like to try to forecast the price of gold?
I've been the answer to the question is no. I don't. I learned a long time ago that that GDP and employment are a lot more stable things to forecast, and so when you miss it, you're not off by a lot. Okay, with gold and with stock market, those things do this, and they're all over the place. What has surprised, and so I said, no, that's not going to do this. But surprisingly, what surprised me is that in the last couple of months, gold prices dropped, and I got to tell you, next week, if it's still down, I'm thinking of buying some. Now that's not, that's just me, but I have no idea where it's going. But I've really been surprised it has been dropping in the last 2 or 3 months. That has really surprised me. At the same time, Bitcoin's been going through the roof. So, but gold, silver, Bitcoin, these are all hedges essentially. And I would not recommend anybody play that game. I think NC scratch off lottery that helps education at the end is probably a better bet, but that's just me.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
All right. So I've just, thank you to my colleague, Dr. John Conadan, and thanks to all of you for joining us for the UNC Charlotte Economic Forecast. So we want you to go ahead and save the date for the next economic forecast. So it'll be at noon on Wednesday, May 26th. And if John is right, most of you will be vaccinated by then. So please also join us for these upcoming events. On Thursday, March 11th, the Belk College welcomes alumnus Chris Peak, President and CEO of Caramont, to the CEO Speaker Series. And you can see the rest of the events listed there. And you can learn more about our upcoming events at belkcollege.uncc.edu/50events. So one last note for you. So sponsors provide essential funding for the research and publications associated with this forecast and help keep the quarterly event complimentary to students, alumni, and members of the business community. So for sponsorship information, you can email us at belkrsvp@uncc.edu. And then we've got a QR code on the next slide to help us plan future Belk College virtual events and be entered in for a chance to win a Belk College gift pack. Please complete our brief online survey by scanning this QR code. So this concludes the program today. Please stay safe and well.